Mediopolis, Chapter 9. Strange Shows. I just don't want to end up on one of those obsessive shows, said the older man. Now they were sat in the consultation room, a comfortable room of comfortable chairs, sat upstairs, relaxing. They were in a snug, small, calming room, with calming music being played. She put on to help relax him, too, upstairs in their private room together. Are you that obsessive? Asked the mother, looking back at him. Aren't we all under the microscope? Asked the elder, going on to explain that it was his theory that all people had different types of obsessions. I don't know all of us yet, do I? Said the mother. Who of all of us are we talking about? No one can make everyone, can they? She'd said they'd had a few drinks together and been chatting about other casual things beforehand, before plunging into it. Well, everybody I met, that's what I meant before, claimed the older man. Everybody I've met has some obsession, some type of obsession, however few or small, that could get out of hand, stated the older man. Well, perhaps, said the mother, perhaps it's you obsessed with obsessions, she said, holding a drink, looking at him, and looking for people's obsessions, she claimed, as a way to cope with your own, she then added. Thinking it over, the man was sat on the couch with her opposite him on the chair. You think obsessive people I'm attracted to because of my own obsessions? Or is it that obsessive people are attracted to me? Asked the older man, thinking it over himself, asking both himself perhaps and her, enjoying now the effects of the drink as it began to take its effect, slipping slightly deeper into the chair now, feeling a little snugger. That we weren't sure how to get on at the beginning, he thought. Hopefully, no, he won't be hoisted up later, having to be hauled up by the student's sons when he was too drunk. He hoped he wouldn't be. By a pair of laughing students, no doubt. He had visions later on of the concerned mother ordering them to lift him up and take him there to the guest room down the corridor. He imagined it as a possible ending to the evening, if he wasn't left drunk to collapse on the couch, perhaps. No, it's not necessarily the obsessions, began the mother again. Maybe it's just how you're coping with it, said the mother, after some thought. Yeah, I've learnt many things from other people's struggles too, and yours even, said the older man. Mine, said the mother, shocked that he was bringing her into this. My obsessions. What obsessions? She asked him back. You're the one saying that, me, I need to draw more towards others and think about others. I said it drew you towards others, said the mother. What are these obsessions that you think I have, then? She asked back. Well, said the older man, after some thought, hesitating, not really wanting to give his full answer to begin with. I think it's to mother people, if I'm honest, began the older man. But the mother denied that she had been especially mothering two others, except for her own children, and he'd just witnessed that within the family house. That was all, she claimed. She said that she was trying to marry off the older man because she felt sorry for him, cared for him a little as a friend, and introducing him to the family instead of just allowing him to introduce himself wasn't especially being motherly, she claimed, and not patronising in any way, she argued, however. She argued it was just something that a friend would do, and she'd do that to others also. She did it just because he happened to be around the other children, more for their benefit than his. No, she denied that it was because she thought he couldn't introduce himself properly, or that her introductions of him were much better anyway. No, nothing to do with that, she claimed, just because she was around the children and they would understand her interpretation of him much more. That's what she claimed. After a long discussion, she did admit, however, yes, she often did over-worry about others, especially other friends that she knew, and even acquaintances too, and other clients that she saw at work. She did have a tendency to over-worry, she said, and admitted. She worried about others that she didn't know that well enough. Well, she didn't really know sometimes if the worry was justified or not, to be honest, sometimes. And her eldest son, too. Well, he had accused her of over worrying too, as had the older daughter too, sometimes. Both the elder children, they had accused her of being a little overprotective sometimes, because she found it difficult to allow them more freedom over the last few years. Watching his data shows with him, even casually following his dates sometimes, never for too long though, just because she had worried about his potential dating partners, who found it strange, some of them at least, to have their date's mum later following them. And the son had been annoyed at the time. He was annoyed that the dates were sometimes getting a little creeped out by the mother following them later on, following some of their video perhaps, even though the mother had only really been following their public showings, their public videos, public pictures, and a few public posts as well. Not following all of their private shows or even asking for them. Nothing at all. Other dates had been a little put off by the following mother, finding it just too over the top and just going too far with it, really. Whilst there had been a few that actually found it a little endearing, even that she cared enough to take that much interest in him still, and she was making an effort to try to get to know his new friends, even if she was perhaps asking lots of leading questions to try and vet his potential partners. And she need never know what happened on the private date shows that he really had with them. Of course, she wouldn't know, except she could work out some of that from the public shows of either her son or sometimes his partners afterwards. Awaking after a long rest at the family's house, having stayed overnight and fallen asleep in the strange small room upstairs, the consultation room that had somehow morphed later into a resting sleeping room, the elderly man then awoke cold alone in the morning, where he found by the bedside table a small piece of paper, a poem it seemed to be. Gosh, he was surprised to read it and to be comforted by it in the morning, or confronted by it. A small poem that the mother had presumably left behind, written on a scrap of paper that was left on the bedside table. Alongside was a cold morning cup of tea, one that he did drink a little later on. He began wondering why she left it for him, though. Was it some kind of weird instruction of hers for him? Whilst he stayed at the house, they hadn't discussed how long he'd be staying there, or what he'd be staying there for. Never mind, it looked more like a children's poem. Oh, perhaps it was just some laugh of hers or something, and he read it to himself. 1:30, still having fun. Time to make that morning run. 2:30, confessing to truths, the questioning of yous. 3:30, please wait for me, and now it's time for us to tea. 4:30, answer the door, don't forget to mop the floors. 5:30, just get a life, struggle through the strug and strife. 6:30, time to match and mix, thinking active quick. 7:30, songs for heaven, prayers for the felling. 8:30, open the gates, all men must, they meet their fates. 9:30, check everyone's fine, prioritize all your times. 10:30, the cycle ends again. Dried up inkless zen. 11:30, searching for heavens, or questionings of the elders. 12:30, a newer older, returning to health, retrieving your wealth. Well, a strange, bizarre poem. Perhaps it was some order or something, some kind of weird thing she'd written for him. Goodness knows why or what it was meant to be. He puzzled over it, looking a little bit puzzled. Why or what she'd left it there for. Supposing that maybe it was some notes about house rules while he was there, but it was done in a casual, jokey fashion, so he doubted that. Well, perhaps it was that she wanted some feedback of some poem and wanted his review of it. He felt that it was perhaps that. Well, perhaps it was a little funny and strange, and alluring of her even. Something interesting in it. A little whimsical note, perhaps. Something an adolescent might do. And she was an older woman. He'd never expected it of her. More, not from a grown-up woman, no. Or was this just her having fun with him, or attempted fun? Something that she hoped for. Well, perhaps it wasn't some part of some strange belief that she had. He hoped not, however weird. Some weird routine that she perhaps might try and impose upon him, something she'd not learnt about her before. All very well if it was expected of the children, if it was just for them. Even if he stayed on at the family care home for a while to help care for some of the older children, and for them to make occasional cup of tea, to visit for the occasional chat. He hadn't argued or agreed to any of the rules yet. Well, they'd not discussed them in depth, really. They hadn't discussed it at all, really. And the mother had left it to him to sleep off the hangover after he drunk heavily the night before, taking him slowly, ushering him along to the small guest room where they talked more, leaving him there a cup of tea in the morning and a small piece of paper, her note, that he had found many hours later when awakening to find the cold, still undrunk cup of tea that he did drink later out of politeness, and read the note not knowing why or what its meaning was. Supposing this was just the woman's way of communicating her plans for the day or the night, and not every day, perhaps. Why did she write the poem, though? If it was just that, it was just a poetic exploration, like some of her dancing was, or some of her mothering attempts were, perhaps. They were more, perhaps, just vices, things that went too far, he thought, looking over it again and putting it to one side. Sometimes he just went too far with the dancing and with the talking and rambling as well, although she perhaps meant well. Many of the things he didn't quite understand about her still yet. Always trying to be the motherly figure he felt, though, who didn't really. Sometimes the people around her didn't really need mothering that much in that way, though. Or turning to her poems or the dances, he felt perhaps whether they were just a little too sad or distanced from him or provoked feelings in him that she just didn't expect would be provoked. Things that perhaps made him feel a little sad or a little angry. And maybe she hadn't wanted him to feel that way at all. He felt that she was forever turning serious issues into a song and a dance. Maybe she was just trying to find a happy thing in it. But he felt that maybe she was just belittling him or trying to undermine the seriousness of it sometimes, or just didn't understand what his serious issues were yet. He worried that his own complexes and his vices, and perhaps even his virtues, were all just perhaps material for her poems or for her songs and dances to form part of her later shows. Perhaps. Perhaps he was just a potential character to fit into one of her poem shows or dance shows, something that he was now a captive to one of her story shows he wearied and worried about. So much now that he felt that he had himself to write down a more serious, methodical account of the situation himself. He wanted to write a more rational story of the how, when, where, and the why that they had both met, to explain the circumstances of how it happened, how they were concerned, inquiring friends to begin with, feeling an increasing need to understand and know each other more, and to visit each other's homes and families more, and the need to make more of an acquaintance with each other's families and each other's loved ones. The mother, the subject of now his investigations, he tried to write about honestly and as sensitively as he could do in his accounts of her. And he also wrote of her other relations, those that he had met through her, especially the older children so far, those that he struck up conversations with. And of their relationships to each other, he also wrote about a little briefly too. And of their relations, although early and premature, to him. He wrote a summary of his thoughts about that, and how he felt about each of them so far, especially about the mother, since their relationship journey had gone on some time, over the months now, as her visits to him had slowly increased, and he'd now begun his longer visit with her, not knowing yet how long he would stay on, though, with her and the family. This reasonable, factual account that he'd written and he made now triple copies of, feeling that at least he had tried to make his own record, fearing that they might also all be making their own different kinds of records also. He was then sending one of the triple copies that he made to an older friend, someone that he did in a practice quite often, just so that there were always other copies of his own thoughts that his other friend also stored. And then he had a third copy in case those he was writing about, and four in case they also wanted a copy of it also. He would keep the other copy of the triples to himself, that he would always retain for himself, in case there was something wrong with his own memories. Perhaps he would later rely upon it. Perhaps not, but it would stay in the archives there, dusty and unread, if he never did rely on it anyway. He would keep his own copy in the old house that would be bulked down in the large storage area in the archives. He'd no intention of making that story public. No, not yet. It remained just one of the many private stories that he'd written of a few of the others that he'd met. As he hadn't yet become a character in any of their public shows, not in the mother's public showings or the other family public shows, no, not yet, only had the private stories about him so far. Perhaps they would all swap their private stories with each other before sharing with strangers and the rest of the world in their public shows. And the family elderly visitor, Mr. Porter, known in the family also as Mum's client, Mum's friend, the older man, the older visitor, the wallower to some people, the strange man, and Mr. or Mystery Porter to a few as well. To the few of the family, although he had yet to discover all of those other titles and names that were being swapped about him. He had even been called Mum's latest experiment by a couple, although that was really just taken as a joke. He wasn't really sure, after watching those episodes back, if that was really said that way seriously, even if the others had all laughed about it, the adolescents having a chat. The grown-up children, as he liked to call them. They were also more just younger adults at that age, when they were study showing and a part-time work showing. Only part-time, though. He really only thought of the eldest two as grown-up children, after spending so much time getting to talk with their mother so much, and a little more time with them also now. In another late-night chat show with the mother, talking about them at length, in fact, as she often did. That was her term of endearment for them. Not his, though, of course. The grown-up children. When she was around the mother, with herself, she had not been present with the children, and the younger adults had called him those names. They didn't refer to him as Mum's victim, or Mum's latest experiment, or Mum's father figure, not around him, not when he was present himself, or the latest father figure, as perhaps others had said. Yet surely she'd also watch back those shows as well, and would comment later, when and if she got a chance to. Perhaps she hadn't been aware of those. Yet surely she would eventually, unless she didn't always get a chance to see all of them, being so busy with so many of the children, and out working so often, visiting the clients in dance shows and the care shows also. And even maybe she didn't know that that's what they thought, because they talked so often to each other in so many of the different shows. She didn't get a chance to see any of them, only the highlights, really. Or was it just only a joke, a casual joke that they would make anyway? If they really had seriously thought those things, then would they really have said it so openly and so casually? Perhaps if he was expected to do something fatherly with her, for her, or the children. Had all the visits been some audition towards some grandfathering role, perhaps? He'd wonder that a little, because they seemed to be missing grandparents, although he'd seen the videos about them from long ago. Perhaps he was being introduced there as a potential grandparent to her as a father or potential father, and to the children too as a potential grandfather. He'd no idea. Or just a potential friend of the family. No, he didn't yet know really what their expectations of him were. He'd been told about a few of them that had been before him. A few of the past grandparents, and the grandfathers too, had seen many of their pictures and their shows, of course, and heard many of the mothers' stories of them too. He saw the photo shows, one of the evenings, with them as a family all together watching. They watched the return, the procession of various visitors, all sat at the dining tables, having a family dinner, and then dressing up in the costumes for the garden shows, for the play shows, with the room then in pitch black later on, still in their costumes, as they were watching the family reunion film shows together for one of the family show occasions. They showed the family looking much younger in those shows. Sometimes they were missing some of the younger children that hadn't been born yet. They were missing altogether, in the case of the younger ones. And there was a number of older women who weren't present in those visits that were in the film. Many of the auntie figures that were often told to him. The mother gave brief descriptions of who they had been. A conveyor belt of the aunts, who appeared as quickly as they vanished. The older men were as many too, and as fleeting. Although it seemed some lasted many months, a few passed a year, none beyond a few years, perhaps, though. Although a small handful, they seemed to reappear occasionally, revolving door cases that returned time and time again, their appearances changing, hair growing longer, makeup getting thicker or more glossier, or vanishing altogether, or looking with more scars, more stretch marks, or more crow's eyes, changing and looking different and older, but returning to different times in later segments of the film. Towards the end of the film, some of them looked much older, and with such a different style as well. Some looked almost unrecognizable towards the end, and the mother had to say it was still the same auntie that it was at the beginning. Unrecognizable. And some of the others that had grown beards, or taken on wigs, shaven hair, or completely changed the costumes, had to be told who they were to the visiting older man. Some of them were in the film for only a few minutes, or half a dozen perhaps. It was perhaps about an hour or hour and a half in its fullest viewing, so it wasn't too long to watch. Not bad for an hour's watch of the visitor film as a recap of the years that had gone by, just to try to know about some of the more important visitors he's likely to meet over the encompassing next few weeks and months. Mostly there were the children's visitor friends that appeared in more recent years, and also many of the mother's friends too, some who were known as the sisters or the aunts to the children, even though there was no real blood relation there, no biological relation. They'd been adopted aunts who'd adopted the children too, and a few of their husbands, the uncles, had become engrossed and encompassed within the family also. There were only a few of those that were really regular visitors in the recent years, though, that appeared frequently in the duration of the film. They appeared frequent but briefly as the characters within the mother's commentary, within her narration, and within the film's story. Whilst the pictures were projected that were shone onto the large giant wall that was shone in front of the large table they were all gathered around to get a good view of the large picture, where she would introduce the various characters or the participants within the story itself, where he was looking up with the rest of them, viewing back on it. Some of them would laugh or joke, or even be sad a little, having sad or serious faces, looking over the events that had happened in the past, recalling and remember, almost reliving it, some of them. Others had watched and been a little tired and bored of seeing it so many times, and were fidgeting or having their own hushed private talks, or just waiting for it to end, watching it yet again. It was as if the older man thought perhaps they were preparing, or the mother was preparing him to meet some of them again, or to meet some of them for the first time, because she was giving such long introductions to them, sometimes interrupting the film itself when giving introductions about some of the more regular visitors that he would be likely to meet. And he was told a few of them that had passed on, and about it being passed on to other places, and others there had been passed on because there had been some argument between them, only a couple that they had fallen out with, that didn't seem to be part of the visitor film any more now. At least, thought the elder visitor, Mr. Porter, though he didn't get into hearing about what the nature of those arguments were, though. Worryingly, now it was him being turned into some actor, he felt, in the next chapter of the visitor film, because he'd be filmed participating, eating, talking, and with the family themselves, watching with the family their old family films, and even reacting to the family films with them too. Would he now be featured in a later family film that others would be viewing too? Although he guessed they would only show it to other visitors of the home, other potential visitors who might also get to know him as a live-in resident of the family show home, if he agreed to stay on, perhaps. Perhaps it would be only those regular visitors that he got to know, those who stayed and got to know the other residents, the family and the friends of the family too. Perhaps there would be the inevitable scene of him reading his story about them, the written account that he'd already written, and of their reaction to it too. And he wondered how they would all react to what he had written about them, to how he portrayed them. Although he tried to do it sensitively sometimes, he wasn't sure that he had been that much. And he tried to be reliable, but he wasn't sure he was that much either. And he wasn't even sure if what he'd written was always that honest, however much he tried to too. Still, he hadn't got to the point where he'd felt the need to share it with them all yet, anyway. He felt that perhaps there would be a little hilarity. They'd find it a little funny what he'd seen and what he'd written in them, what he'd written about them. But he worried that it would also provoke a little anger, that they'd also be a little upset about what he'd written too. They'd find it a little funny, but they'd also find it a little angry and a little sad perhaps too, and perhaps they'd be a bit confused and want to question him more on it. And he wasn't sure really that he wanted to discuss it much more at the moment with them, not feeling he knew enough of them well enough yet anyway, and still getting to know the mother quite well. Still, he felt there would only be mild reactions to what he'd written, since he'd only written a little about them to begin with. He'd hardly written a full expose of his real thoughts and his feelings about them yet. Just a brief record of some concise observations. They were just characters, yes, but not overly flattering, nor had he tried to be overly critical either, really, because he hardly knew them well enough yet to be either, really. Mr. Porter had stayed on in the lounge area after the family visitor film had been shown to him and the rest of the family together, and then agreeing with the mother that they had really seen to be very happy in the past, and that yes, they'd been very happy with some of the aunties, and he'd be more than happy to meet a few of the aunties if they visited. They seemed very nice, very funny, some of them. He'd like to meet some of them, yes, he agreed to that. One of the aunties in particular, agreed was very funny, and he thought, yes, perhaps he would get along with. The mother had suggested that during the showing of the film, remarking often on some of the aunt's funnier ways that she talked about as watching, although he couldn't remember exactly who the Aunt Tora really was. He just remembered a few of the funny incidents of her until he was fully reminded of her style and a few of her funnier voices. Yes, he was recalling those images of her again, re-watching her images once more, and agreed that he would really enjoy visiting and seeing her, and perhaps her visiting them as well. Yes, he was open to the idea of it. And the mother laughed and said yes, she felt that they would get on well, knowing them both fairly well now, she felt. Saying he hadn't even met her yet. How did he know that she would be that enjoyable, though? I mean, they were still strangers. Yes, the mother said and admitted they were still strangers, but she knew them both and was getting to know him a little well and felt that they would get on well and assured him. The mother's friend, Mr. Porter, thought it all over, not wanting to say he was tired of being the only long-term visitor, the only visitor at all at the family house, and for so long now. That's all the family's familiarity with each other. It reminded him of his own loneliness, much more though. However much they tried to include him sometimes, it reminded him of his own detachments, his own distant families. He was glad there wasn't any other visitor films at his home. They would be strange visitor films for others to see, or often quaint visitor films. In fact, most of his visitor films would be just him visiting himself in more recent times, not visiting other visitors, nor many visitors even visiting him. So he was glad of the more recent films. He wasn't expected to show those himself. Who would ever want to see those? He'd gotten so drunk again in the guest room upstairs, in the small, counselling, comforting room. Yet again, he'd been thinking about the strange poem that the woman had left behind. Was it the childish woman who had left that beside the table, next to the cold tea? He still had it in his paperwork, hadn't wanted to throw it away, just folded it neatly, filed it away with some other paperwork, with some of his own notes taken from his apartment. He had briefcases, suitcases, and a few other bags. Some of it was stuffed, crammed full of his own notepaper, just notes that he needed for his own assignments, and his own studies too. He put it in with his own files and folders. She didn't expect him to surely keep all the papers that she'd given to him and left behind. Surely she didn't expect him to keep it with in his own collections. He hadn't wanted to discuss it, not in front of the children, and she was so often, so much of the time, just around them. It was very hard finding much time alone to talk with her about anything. And that little time he wanted to talk and focus on the serious issues and not go off onto discussing some random poem she happened to casually leave behind, if it was that. Well, he would casually mention it perhaps at a suitable time, he felt. Well, perhaps he would bring his own poem too, if that's what was expected. He didn't know. He didn't have to show it to her, if she didn't ask for it himself, or herself. Why had she left it for him? He felt it was a little bizarre, and not to mention anything of it, not to even ask. What did you think about it? And then thinking it over during a later chat, when he was thinking it over, had they just been talking earlier on, before she'd left it, talking about routines, as they'd gotten into a long rambling tale about his needs for structure, his need for structured medication times in order to cope with his current conditions. Because she noticed he'd taken a very long dosage and a very high dosage. And he'd said he'd miss some medication sometimes after her visits, after visiting her, and so he'd sometimes doubled the dose to make up for the missing earlier dosage, sometimes. She was apologetic. If the family and her had sometimes distracted him from his own medication routines, and he'd said it was all his own fault, assuring her that he would sometimes try and set more alarms, and if he was to take the medication, when the children or the visitors were present. Then he would retire back to the guest room alone so that he could take his medication, so that he could do it more focused, alone, without any distractions from her or the rest of the family. And it really was his own fault for just not being more proactive, in being more focused on when the structured routine medication times were meant to be. During that talk, she'd gone off on talking about poems. Now he remembered on her need for structured, medicated poems. She talked at length about her need for medicated poems, that there were therapeutic poems that she needed at different times of the day. Yes, now he remembered all that she had different poems structured in to be alarmed at different times of the day. That she would have poems that she would have in the morning, evening poems, daytime poems, and nightly poems too. All sorts of different poem times she talked about that would be triggered off by alarms, poem alarms that were required at different times. Yes, now he did recall some of that, although he'd been very drunk towards the later time of their discussions. Perhaps it was his talk about the need for his medicated routine of medication times that had led her to her rambled talk about her need for medicated poetry times and her dependency on that of late. Well, perhaps that was the reason that she just left behind a poem at that time in the morning, he later speculated. But who knew? He wasn't really sure about all the alarm times that she had. He would retire back alone to the guest room, away from all the others and away from her, away from the mother. He said that he would set the reminders more consciously. She said yes, that seemed a good idea, especially with the important medications. To which the older visiting friend had said, yes, the alarms were all set to his old home and that he'd had to adapt since moving into the family alones. Since moving in, he'd had to adapt those alarms to the family home itself. And also the different people that he'd be around, turning up the alarms, making them louder at certain times of the day. The mother had said that they would often show shop for a personal alarm for him, if that would help. She was happy to go show shopping for more personal alarms and to find more medicated alarm systems. She was happy to show shop for him, if that would be helpful. He'd only to ask her if that was something that he perhaps would want. He said that he would think it over and consider it perhaps. The friend hadn't wanted to ask why the medications would be done or had to be done alone so much. Why couldn't the children witness it? Why couldn't they be around him when he was doing it? Why couldn't other visitors? Why couldn't she be around him when he had to do the medication sometimes? Why did he have to be so focused, so conscious on it? Why did he not have to be distracted? Why would that be so bad? She had questioned him. She known his old medication routines quite well enough. Not as his new ones, though, not the ones that had recently developed, perhaps, in the more recent weeks, and in the time since he'd moved in to the house, and had to adjust even the newer medications to the newer situations. She'd asked if he needed more help, someone to assist him in the house with the new adaptations to the old medications. Yet he said no, no, and protested, saying no, he had to do it alone and could manage to do it alone, he claimed. And she was doing more than enough, he thanked her already, preparing still all the old medications that she did, and he thanked her doing that well enough, preparing all the old medications, the foods, and the old drinks in the old kitchens. And she frowned a little when he told her all this, looking now at him a little puzzled, asking him in the old session room where they were both sat there together talking in the private, looking at him puzzled, asking him whether these new medications or the new adapted medications were even now compatible with the old ones that she was still giving him, though. Had he really researched it all enough? If the old medications were now compatible with the new adaptations, of the older medications? Were they even complementary as well as compatible with each other? Had he researched that enough? She questioned him. Did he know what he was really doing? Was he capable of knowing? Because she worried for him. The old medications were quite heavy as it was. She knew that from all the many visits. The friend had said, though, after her questions, pleadingly almost, yes, he was okay. So why don't you tell me what it is that's so bad or so difficult, so challenging? What's the mystery that you need to be so alone with the new medications? That's what she'd asked. I could help you do it if it's really that hard, really that difficult. Why can't we just then discuss it more? Asked the mother, probing further. But the friend had said, no, he was okay doing it. Yes, it was an increasing challenge doing it more, but he was still capable at the moment of doing that alone. The older man had shaken his head wearily, saying that it had all been prescribed and he'd been taught, and taught well how to do it, and that he could also learn much more from others well qualified on how to do it as well. Even he didn't really fully understand what he was taking or how he was doing it, but he was researching it much more from others that were qualified to assist him in doing it and understood it much more than him or her. So he couldn't explain it to her, not now. Only gave her some tongue-twisting names about what the whole new complexes were called and the treatment programs too. Said there was a whole book of jargon, complexities about it. But the main thing was, it seemed to be helping a little bit more now. He just needed to be in a lying down, resting position to more fully absorb it all properly, to be able to focus on adjusting to all the different changing needs much more. After his explanations, she was still a little doubtful, still probed a little more, hoping that he wasn't injecting or something, or doing something that was very difficult or too challenging for him to do alone. And he'd stated to her, though, trying to reassure, it was all oral medication that was relatively simple to take himself. He just had to be cautious, careful about doing all the correct dosage measuring amounts. And he was more careful in doing and measuring out those amounts. They were relatively simple, though, to take if he was more cautious. Yet what it was and what its effects were, they were hard for him to explain, he claimed. He did so by struggling even to pronounce a few of the different names of the group of the different compound chemicals, the combination of which that he was using in the different combination of treatment therapies. After his brief attempts to try and explain, or to even try and pronounce a few of the tongue-twisting names, she even laughed at some of his slip-ups. And after struggling through 5 or 6 readings or attempted readings of the complex names, of some of the different chemical compounds, of the different complex treatments that he apparently was taking, after reading through some of the microscopic glasses that he had on, of the incredibly long lists of the different ingredients, she then stopped him eventually, said that he needn't go on in the explanations anymore of what it all was, and just to call it the new medications, as yes, she admitted it was simpler that way. She didn't understand half of the terms that he was using or what they even meant. The biological effects on them also. No, she hadn't understood half of what those terms meant either, even when he'd just begun the explanations of them too. Yes, he said, they were so numerous, what those chemical compounds were, and also what the different biological effects were. Those effects were affecting also numerous internal organs with it, and they were affecting them a number of complex different ways, claimed the older man. That it was far too difficult for him to easily summarize, either to her or to others. It wasn't that he was hiding it, he just had the inability. It was too much of a challenge, and he was overwhelmed in actually being able to simplify it and to explain it all clearly. It was just way too overwhelmingly complex for him to even understand in order to explain to anyone. That was the reason that he hadn't been able to more fully explain the new medications, so the older man had claimed. There were lots of potential benefits and side effects, both of which he was struggling to still try and fully understand more of. They were all possible, and he was trying as much as he could, from what he understood, to weigh up those benefits against the potential side effects also. But he couldn't exactly recall what entirely all of them were, not fully, not to her now. He could at least refer her to some of the articles and the notes made about it, if she wanted to really research and get to know much more about it. And he could refer her to those. They could tell her far more about the potential experiences, what he was going through, than he ever could, than any of his ridiculous memories or his feebled layman's attempts to try and understand it could. Yes, she said that she would potentially look into much more of that if she felt it was potentially relevant, and if he needed her to help with the new medications in any way, then she could always look at some of those research papers. She had agreed. If she wanted to know more, they could tell her, those articles, far much more than his memories of what they were about. And the friend had then asked, what were the actual effects that he was experiencing, though? After all, the articles couldn't tell her about that. After these sessions, he'd said only that he felt much more tired with it. Yes, he felt a little better sometimes, but it was also just too early in the new treatments to know yet. He couldn't even give her a full list of all the different organs involved, never mind to know how they were all being affected differently. He could just name a few of them and a few of the effects that they were going through during the actual process. The older friend had tried to reassure her. In general, it seemed to be going okay. He perhaps felt a little better, but he was only cautiously optimistic. Perhaps he felt often and muchly the same as he had done before the new medications, and that it was just too early yet to know. He remembered their discussion on the need for the routine medications earlier on in one of their earlier sessions. He'd not drunken, not that much, not at that point. So he'd been reasonably corpus mentis, reasonably had good recall, and could remember things quite well at that point. He talked a lot more about his past jobs, past relationships, about his past life, his past professional roles as well. While she also had chatted much more about her current job, her current relationships, her current family life, current family shows, telling him much more about all her other dancing shows, all the other dance classes that she attended, as if they also were just characters in a great story that he'd been part of and was getting to know more of, yet had still to meet. Potential dance partners, he suspected. Potential family partners and friendship partners too. The tales of the many elderly spinsters, of missing old bats, or of lonely older women who sat alone, watching all the other elderly couples dance, year after year, just longing to be swept off into a stranger's dance. And she talked about some poet that she dated long ago. Was an ex-poet, perhaps. Yes, she still said after some time, after some thought, answering the concerned elder father's questions, thinking that she should be swept away by some Wordsworth, charmed out of her rational thought and sensibilities, and then on thinking it over, she had said he was still a friendly poet, not just the ex-poet. Yes, she was still friendly with the man she described as a poet. He wasn't still just the ex-poet to her, but a friendly poet also. She always still just thought of him as the poet, poeticizing everything as he did in his way. Perhaps she did too sometimes, as a result of spending so much time together and with him. It would offend the eldest son if she'd said that. Offend the eldest son too, since he had the poet as his tutor for some of the time, for his creative writing tutor, as well as also a mentor, a father figure, as he still was, although much distantly now, a distant mentor that sometimes spoke to the older son. They had still a friendly relationship and talked occasionally, watched each other's videos, talked on the phone occasionally. Even if he had to visit the ex-poet occasionally, who wasn't a close, friendly poet to the woman now, but he was still close to a few of the older children, still friendlier with them. And still, she was still a little friendly occasionally to him. He was a strange poet now, a strange friendly poet, perhaps, though. A strange friendly ex-poet, who knew? Perhaps he'd still remain obscure in some ways, in some of his poems, to her, though. That's how she explained it to the older man, the older friend. Certainly, she must have loved the poems, and his poetry, to date and to be in a relationship with the poet for so long. Yet not enough to have a poetic marriage. No, not fully. They'd never had the poetic marriage, it seemed. Yet her love of the poems, later, had grown in the relationship with him. They'd introduced each other to great many poets and many poems. She also wondered, though, as the relationship developed, was perhaps the poem a way of him masking a hidden way of his life? Her love of poems, like his love of poems. She wondered later, was it also them masking a hidden hatred of cliched poets and always trying to find new ways to express things interestingly? Or a fear of strange poets somehow, perhaps that had developed over the years too, of being misportrayed or mispoeticized by others, and always the desperate need to describe oneself more clearly in one's own poem. Was that something that her and the ex-poem or the ex-poet friend had both dwindled or journeyed into together? She confessed her fear of those strange poems, and the fear of an absence of poems too. Confessed to desiring in equal measure. A life of too many poems and a life without poetry would be awful, she'd said. She'd gone dancing more recently. Almost, wondered the older father, perhaps to escape the poets and all their words. So if she kept moving and kept dancing to the rhythm of the dance, of others' dances and her own dances, perhaps if she kept moving, kept dancing, and kept just moving so much, however slowly or fast, just kept dancing, perhaps she wouldn't be there discussing or dancing or poeticizing so much. Then she wasn't at home brooding on the poet's sentences or trying to decipher his different meanings, his different words, and the various enigmas that they all left behind. The visiting poets had all left behind their words at the family's house. And she wouldn't be there trying to decipher the meanings, not if they were all out dancing, moving, enjoying their life, and active in their lifestyles. Was that why she had left him behind, had left that poem behind, when she'd left the morning? When she'd left that morning, she had left the poet behind, carrying on some tradition, moving off in her way. She'd explained and discussed that during their sessions with the older man, but he knew little about the poet therapists, nor about the dance therapists either.